Education, PhD in pharmacology, University of Alberta. MD, University of Calgary. Professional experience, this is obviously historical. Senior research scientist, as I've said. And then professor and head, Department of Plant Science, Faculty of Agriculture, Dalhousie University. Chair, International Society of Horticultural Science Commission for Sustainability through Integrated and Organic Horticulture. And the most important thing they left out, and that is that Dr. Prange is the originator of the dynamic CA chlorophyll fluorescence technology, as well as involved in its commercialization. Awards, Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. Publications, co-author of the 3rd edition of the book, Controlled Atmosphere Storage of Fruit and Vegetables. Dr. Prange has visited South Africa, this is my own version now, several times to introduce the DCA-CF technology. And the rapid uptake of this occurred when DPA was banned in our major markets. Okay, I see Bram has managed to join again. Bram, we're just continuing with Bob's presentation, and then we'll come back to yours at the end. So Bob, if you're ready, if you can share your screen and start your presentation.
Thank you, Richard. I'll just hit share screen here. And
now we see it.
Yep.
We got it.
Okay, now I'll go to slideshow. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. Shall I start now then?
Yeah, you can proceed, please.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation. And the topic is, what is the correct carbon dioxide concentration? And I'm just trying to get things out of the way here on my screen. Okay, so as an introduction, there have been no recent breakthroughs in reliable methods to determine the acceptable carbon dioxide concentration. So one must rely on an indirect approach to choose the correct carbon dioxide concentration. In this presentation, I will examine the utility of selecting the carbon dioxide concentration in CA as a proportion of the recommended oxygen as defined by global use. In other words, using a carbon dioxide divided by oxygen ratio. And why am I talking about carbon dioxide? Well, essentially, too much carbon dioxide can cause external and internal damage in apples and pears. Here's an example of external CO2 damage. It's on Golden Delicious, and this is classic external symptoms when you have too much carbon dioxide, kind of a rusting and browning, and quite often, as you can see on the right, the epidermis actually collapses. Now, internal carbon dioxide damage. This is a slide produced by Dr. David Riddell, a researcher with the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington State. He is showing here variations of internal damage, and to keep it simple, all of these, he says, are caused by too much carbon dioxide. But if you go and look at some of these individually, you might have someone say, oh, well, that's low temperature induced, or low oxygen induced. Dr. Riddell is pointing out that all of these were caused by carbon dioxide. Some of them are classic. The one up on the left is the cavities. You can see quite often with CO2 damage. On the bottom here, you see the brown core. That's been known since the beginning of research on apples and pears as a caused by too much carbon dioxide. The one on the left, some people would say, well, that's low temperature, but quite often what is called low temperature disorders is actually a combination of low temperature and carbon dioxide. So moving right along, I am going to talk about how to avoid CO2 damage. And it'll depend on a number of factors. Cultivar oxygen concentration, and that's obvious. I've got oxygen concentration very much in my mind because I've even shown my cards by saying CO2 to oxygen ratio is important. Stage and storage season, storage temperature, storage humidity, and finally a few points with regard to the chemicals 1-MCP and DPA as it affects carbon dioxide damage. So starting from the top, cultivar and oxygen. Again, I want to reiterate that the concept of the CO2 by oxygen ratio has been accepted in general, but is not well defined. I'll give you one of many examples. This is Dr. Kupferman from 2003. In carbon dioxide intolerant cultivars, the CO2 should remain below, well below the oxygen level at all times. In other words, below a ratio 1.0. So that's a value that you will see coming up in the subsequent screens. Here, I've gone through a cultivar database that I've created over a number of years, harvesting recommendations for every apple and pear I can get with regard to control atmosphere storage conditions. And from that, I have constructed categories of CO2 to oxygen ratio, total of 7. The ones that are most tolerant would have a ratio of 1.5 or more. Next is breaking it down. Next is 1.25 to 1.49. And then, as I mentioned, the ratio of 1.0 is right in the middle there, group 3. And then getting into more sensitive varieties, group 4, group 5, group 6, and finally the most sensitive to CO2 would be group 7. Virtually no CO2 would be tolerated. So in that first group, the most tolerant, that's 1.5 or more ratio, take a look at, and I'm highlighting varieties that you guys would see in South Africa, plus a few others. In that group of most tolerant varieties, you would have Golden Delicious for sure, and the other ones there. And I want to mention L-Star, and I'm coming back to L-Star in a later slide. So just want to point out to you, L-Star is in this group. So is Jonah Gold. By the way, with Golden Delicious, there's 2 footnotes. Notice the second one that it actually has in the literature a recommendation of high CO2, where an industry wants to have the fruit stay greener and firmer. Okay, that's just regard for Golden Delicious. It's a very odd recommendation, as you will come to find out. It's both the only one that your varieties that could tolerate high CO2, but I'll caution that comment, as you'll see in a moment. Okay, next group would be Gala and Delicious. Those are varieties you grow in South Africa. Notice the sample size for Gala. It's 56 sample size. That means 56 recommendations I found around the world. That's the highest of any variety of apple or pear in my data set. So that's what that number means. So the ratio for Gala is 1.35, Delicious 1.25. And continuing down, you're getting into more sensitive varieties now, Granny Smith, Grips Pink, Fuji, Kanzi, and Cox Orange Pippin is in this group. And then in the, I'm skipping a number of groups because you don't have them in South Africa, but you're in group 5, getting into very low tolerance. You have Brayburn and Honeycrisp, and that's known as Honey Crunch in Europe. These are very sensitive to carbon dioxide. On the pear list, in general, pears are more sensitive to CO2, but within the pears, the groups listed here show Packham's Triumph is probably the most tolerant with a ratio just above 1. And then after that, it gets into very intolerant: Farrell, Bosc, Williams, Comis, Anjou, and Abate Fattel or Abbey Fattel is very sensitive. Now, I mentioned that oxygen is important. As you drop the oxygen, you must drop the CO2 to maintain a certain specific ratio for that variety. But I've come to find out, and this is with an example of just one variety, it's Gala, with a huge data set, that once you get down into very low oxygen, in this case, it's below 1 to 2.0. kPa is the same as a percent, so that's 1 to 2%. You get below that, the ratio of CO2 to oxygen can actually go up. And if you look at this slide, way up in the corner here, almost no oxygen is a ratio of over 9. This is from a recommendation in the literature. It's not something measured, but you can see that in ratio terms, fruit become more tolerant to CO2 at very low oxygens. I mean, very low. Okay. Now, the next factor was stage of storage. And here's the take-home message. High CO2 at the beginning of storage is more damaging than later in storage. This is a new table. You folks are the first to see it. I've gone through my database looking for the varieties that you grow, such as Brayburn, Delicious, Crisp Pink, Fuji, Gala, Golden Delicious, Granny Smith, and Kanzi. And Comis is there from the pears, but there's only one that happens to be Comis. These are examples in the database where certain industries have recommended delaying the application of CO2 or CA, in fact. Brayburn stands out. There are at least 4 examples there where they say don't even think of CA, keep them in air for different days depending on the recommendation I found in the literature. Notice the range of days here. It's roughly 14 to 21 days. Delicious, it says keep below 1%, and that is for the first 42 days. So you can see Crisp Pink back to no CA, keep it in air. Different researchers say one says 5, one says 21. And you can go down through the list for Fuji, Gala, Golden Delicious, and Granny Smith, Kanzi is there, and one lone recommendation from pears, the Comis, keep it in air for 21 days. Now notice I'm mentioning the days because here's Elstar. I mentioned earlier, Elstar is very tolerant to CO2, but here's an example of research by Dirk Kupka from on Elstar recently, 2024. He's looking at how CO2 injury and internal browning after 5 months of CA storage is affected by the CA pre-storage time in 0.3% CO2 and afterwards storage at 10% CO2. So he's intentionally providing 10% CO2 just to try and cause CO2 damage. What you're seeing here along the bottom is the days 0, 4, 10, at which 10% CO2 was provided. And you can see at day 0, 10% CO2 causes a lot of damage. And as you wait, he waited a number of days. You can go along the bottom, somewhere around 28 days at that point, and afterwards, adding 10% CO2 didn't do a thing. No internal browning, no CO2 injury. And so it's around 28 days, and that's for Elstar. So there is something there for you to consider as an industry. If you find you have something sensitive CO2, think of holding back on the CO2 accumulation at the beginning and maybe use 28 days as a point, a metric to shoot for. It's something you have to work with a bit, I think. Now, temperature. I found from recommendations in my database that there is a declining CO2 to oxygen ratio with chilling temperature. This appears to occur mainly in high CO2 tolerant cultivars such as Golden Delicious. What I'm trying to say there is in this graph, you see the blue data set, that's Fuji. Fuji doesn't like CO2. And varieties like that, it doesn't matter a heck of a lot what the temperature is. It just doesn't like CO2 at a cold temperature, same at a high temperature. But if you have a variety like Golden Delicious, it is known as more tolerant. And as you drop the temperature on that tolerant variety, you can see the tolerance disappears if you chill the fruit. And by the way, these data points less than 0 Celsius, or especially the lowest ones, those are actually South African temperature recommendations. And I still don't understand why South Africa storage operators really like storing below 0 Celsius. They are an outlier in the world. Okay. What's going on here? There's two things that could be happening with chilling temperature. Just as a basic point in physics, any gas, and that includes CO2, becomes more soluble in a liquid phase at a lower temperature. So CO2 stays in liquid phase much better at a cold temperature. And that's not a good thing because CO2 can change its structure and become more damaging. And that can happen just by dropping the temperature. It stays soluble in liquid phase instead of off-gassing out of the fruit. The other thing, and here's the data to show it from 1967, and there's more recent results that I am not showing. When you drop the temperature in the fruit, the RQ value drops in the fruit. RQ is the production of carbon dioxide divided by the consumption of oxygen in the fruit. It's a ratio, but it's the production of CO2 divided by the oxygen. Whether you have no CO2 present, which is the top group here, or CO2 present, you will see as you drop the temperature from 7.2 down to 0, RQ is going up. That means CO2 production divided by oxygen consumption goes up. In fact, if you didn't know anything about the factors involved here, you could look at those 0 Celsius degree values and say, these fruits are anaerobic. That's an RQ associated with anaerobic fruit, but it's not. It's just simply dropping the temperature on the fruit. One can also see the same phenomenon with harvest watch fluorescence. When you drop the temperature, the harvest watch fluorescence likewise shows an uptick in the baseline, and that's immediately seen. Okay, so the RQ is affected by the temperature. Moving on to humidity. Storage humidity is not very well appreciated, and I wish it was a bit more. There's a lot I can say on storage humidity, but with regard to carbon dioxide, I want you to take a look at this data set from Hans de Wilde from Wageningen University. Lowering storage humidity can reduce CO2-related disorders. So this happens to be with conference pears, and the water loss is shown along the bottom. And take a look at the tissue browning, the blue, and the cavities, the brown color, I guess, orange color. Quite a significant drop when you achieve water loss, at least 2 to 3%. And this is an example. There are other examples in the literature. of how humidity and water loss, a little bit, goes a long way to reducing disorders that are associated with carbon dioxide. Final topic. We have come to a point in our industry where one MCP, known under various brand names now, not just the one from Agri-Food, there's competing products, but I'll just call it one MCP, has become part of normal operating procedures in many apples. Not so much in pears. It's just not been that great a compound for pears. And there's the old standby diphenylamine, or DPA. And the point I'm making, and I'll show you in a moment, is that the ratio of CO2 to oxygen in CA should be lower if MCP is used. Now, I've gone through my data set, and it may take a bit of attention here on what I'm showing you. So the first column is cultivars of apples, and I think a number of those would be grown in South Africa. Now, the next column, I have a CO2 ratio. The first one is where it's just CA. There's no MCP ratio that's recommended. The next column is CA plus MCP, and I want to point out that's MCP added at the beginning of storage. I found a number of recommendations in this condition, and I calculated the CO2 oxygen ratio, which is in that column. And the final column is the percent of that MCP treated room as a percent of CA alone. So the ratio, for instance, I'll pick out one here, delicious. That's 42% right here. That means that when you have MCP added to the CA room, it drops the CO2 to oxygen ratio to about 42% of what it would be in CA alone. And to kind of push this all into one general value, taking the average of all these, it's about 48%. That's what this red arrow is telling you down here. So this is preliminary because it's difficult to get this kind of information. So I have a small data set. I have a lot on CA alone, but very few of CA plus MCP. This is important to note here, that this is MCP applied before CA starts. Keep in mind that applying MCP after CA has been adopted, after CA is being adopted, that is, there's a lot of practice now of MCP added at the end of CA, maybe 3-4 months in storage or thereafter. This may alter the need to reduce the CO2 oxygen ratio recommendation. Okay, so that's cautionary comment. Final comment is regarding diphenylamine. At some point, and the South African industry is well aware of this because they are marketing their fruit to the European Union and other places. As you can see here, there was countries where DPA was banned, and the European Union, Great Britain, India, Norway, Russia, Turkey. However, there are a lot of other countries in the list that still accept DPA. And why am I talking about DPA? Well, even though it's not recommended, DPA is really for scald control, superficial scald control. It has been found to also help reducing carbon dioxide damage. Very little in the recommendation category, but here's 2 examples. Apples in the US, if you don't treat them at DPA, you have to keep the CO2 low for the first 3 days. If you treat them at DPA, you can let the CO2 be higher right from day 0. Another variety, Macintosh, this is apple in the US and Canada. If it's just CA, 2.5% CO2 US, 2% Canada. At MCP, there it goes down to 0.5. But now if you have 2 chemicals, the MCP, but add the DPA back in, you see that the recommendation is let the CO2 go back up. So the DPA is being used as a second chemical to help protect against the CO2 damage, be it in normal CA where you've got CO2 high, or where certainly if you add MCP, you're really at risk of damage. I've extracted a lot of this from my book. You can get this in print. I put it on Amazon Kindle. You can go there. Caution, I've dropped for you guys. It should be there as $29 Canadian. I checked this morning. Amazon's still posting at $99, the ebook version. If you want it, wait for a few days. If you don't see it dropping to $29, I'll get in touch with Amazon and get that price down for you. Final thoughts. Of course, if no history of CO2 damage, leave everything as is. Do not consider any changings. However, if you have CO2 damage, or external and or internal, you've got to go through this list. Start scrubbing CO2 during loading and cooling. Scrub CO2 during oxygen pull down. And just as a side comment, get your temperature, oxygen, CO2 monitoring systems running so you have that data set. Once you're in CA, control the CO2 levels according to the CO2 oxygen ratio for that variety. Consider scrubbing CO2 for the first few weeks. That is, I'm proposing 4 weeks. You guys can play with that. There is evidence that cultivars that tolerate this high CO2 as a ratio may actually lower their tolerance at chilling temperatures. That was the one I showed you with Gold Delicious. If you go into DCA, that is less than 1% or 1 kp oxygen, there is evidence that the ratio can be higher. If MCP is applied at the beginning of storage, you should reduce the CO2 by approximately 50%. And finally, if DPA is allowed, it may reduce risk of CO2 damage, and that'll have to be evaluated by your researchers and your practitioners. Oops, sorry. I want to come back to the example I showed you, the first. This is that Golden Delicious with external CO2 damage, and here's the narrative. It came out of the data for that room is on the left side here. There's a sister storeroom where there was no disorder. Why did this room get the disorder? We'll take a look at the temperatures and the ratios. I'm not showing the CO2 or the oxygen values. They look rather harmless, but when you start doing the CO2 to oxygen ratio, it pops out at you. This all happened at the beginning of storage. That's the first warning bell. It went too cold too fast. You see right here from 4.8 Celsius down to less than 1. And I remember I mentioned to you that you get below 1 Celsius, you're running into chilling sensitivity. And on the right, it didn't happen, but on the left, they pulled the oxygen down, let the CO2 go up, and one day there was a sudden increase to 4.50, an incredibly high ratio, and that's when you get bad news. There's the damage. Too late. So sorry. Game over. Okay, so that's the end of my discussion on.
Great, thank you, Bob. I know you've gone to a lot of trouble to put this presentation together through the questions you asked. So we really appreciate your contribution. I see there's some similarities between Bram's project and yours. So I'd like him to do his presentation first before we go into questions. See what maybe there's some overlap in some parts. So if you can just hold off for a while, and if we can, Bram, if you can share your screen, please, and proceed with your presentation. You throw the floor open for questions. Does anyone have any questions for either presenter at this stage? Perhaps I can just start with one. I don't know if I understood you correctly, Bram, but you're looking at a different defect compared to what Dr. Prange was looking at. But for superficial scald, you need to get the temperature down quickly. And Granny Smith, according to Dr. Prange's tables, is slightly sensitive to CO2 damage. So I suppose it's a different cultivar. One has got to do what you have to do for superficial scald, and not to worry about too many defects from chilling injury or CO2 injury in Granny Smith. So I don't know if there's any comment on that.
Richard, I think you misspoke in terms. My thing is you should lower the oxygen quite fast. But yes, to enable to do that, you need to get your core temperature down as soon as possible, of course. So generally, I don't think once you're in a large commercial room. I don't, although some European researchers would say we over-engineer the cooling capacity of our rooms. I don't think we can bring it down to such a speed that it will be a CO2 problem. And I think that nowadays, even if you have 1 in 1,000 apples that do get that problem, the majority of newer pack lines are doing internal sorting, etc. anyway. So I'd rather take that 1 in 1,000 apples hit than get a rejection of a whole batch of fruit based on superficial scald. Your alternative also is then to use something like 1-MCP, which of course our trials were without. And my personal opinion is, in the South African context with Granny Smith, given the longer logistic chains that we are seeing, the harbour issues, that perhaps DCA on its own, given that in extended shipping periods, the superficial scald induction can also happen. Going without 1-MCP is perhaps also a risk that you might not want to take. But obviously, one needs to weigh up the cost of that treatment versus what your marketing team and your logistics can shift and make that an economic question rather than a fruit physiological question.
Thanks for that. Bob, do you have a comment?
Richard, can you compose a question just to make sure I'm trying to answer the questions on your mind?
It was related to lowering the temperature rapidly to control superficial scald, but then you might have other defects such as internal browning. But it depends on the variety, obviously. So in Granny Smith, it's obviously not such a problem because it's only mildly sensitive to CO2 damage according to your figures. So I was just wondering if you had a comment on that.
Okay, I think you're talking about, and I think Bram might be referring to the same thing. You said lowering the temperature fast is a problem. I'm not sure if that's really a problem with regard to Granny Smith. Rapid cooling in and of itself is not going to be a factor, I think. I think I'll just kind of relate to you an experience with regard specifically to Granny Smith that connects, affirms what Bram is saying. From a commercial packing house in Washington State, they've come to find out it doesn't really matter how fast you drop the temperature, get it down as soon as you can. More importantly is they want that oxygen down fast. And that's agreeing totally with what Bram is telling us, that do you want to get that oxygen down? Now, the part that I'm warning about is that as you do something like that, be mindful of any CO2 that may show up and make sure that the CO2 to oxygen ratio is within the norm for that variety. Okay. If you let that CO2 oxygen ratio drift up, just by dropping the oxygen, you could generate a ratio that's dangerous. You got to get the scrubbers going to scrub the CO2 to keep that CO2 under, as a ratio, under the acceptable value for Granny Smith. So cooling, rapid cooling and rapid oxygen pull down for skull control in Granny Smith is a viable operating target. I think that's what Bram is saying as well.
Here, any other questions? Okay, what about you?
Putting me on the spot. Anyway, no, I was also just going to comment on Bram's, what Bram said, and the 1-MCP. I think, and the oxygen. The lower the oxygen, the better. And the combination. I mean, we've done Monja's Gerber's work showed that very beautifully, all the different treatments. I think we had 12 different industry treatments. And so if you do DCA, CF together with 1-MCP, that lasted the longest. And if you have ethylene management in the beginning and at the end even, that, and this was not part of this actually forum, but that worked for her the best, or in her trials with Granny Smith. But like Bram said, it's all about when you market. If you don't store them that long, that is fine. The other comment I wanted to make is I've seen this season that some of the grannies had cold burn. So it's fine to bring them down very fast, but one just needs to be, again, very mindful about the forced air cooling, that one doesn't do it that fast. Yeah, anyway, so, but usually I haven't seen that before. So that was the first time I've seen that.
Thanks, Elke. Any other comments?
Elke, can you clarify what you mean? What damage are we talking about here? That you...
So it doesn't look like, I mean, some of the people on here might know better, but some of the pictures I've seen, it looks like a cold burn. It looks like it's directional from where the cold came from. So it didn't look like superficial scald. It was too round and too much on the top where the forced air cooling came from. So to me, it looked like a cold burn rather than something else. It might be something else. I'm not sure. It's just something I'm putting out there that one needs to be maybe mindful of. And it wasn't, it was on the early grannies. So yeah, anyway.
Would it be, did you consider the CO2 burn on the surface, especially if the skin was wet? It'll actually just burn, almost like a chemical damage if the fruit are wet.
Yeah, we need to think about that maybe.
Because the CO2 will stay in that surface water, and you can easily generate, you can prove that in the lab. I've seen it done. I call it it's like the external burn. It's not collapsing it to the classical CO2 damage, but again, you have to watch the your temperature and other gas concentrations, and then do some forensic review of what happened when.
Yeah, unfortunately, I wasn't there for your talk now, so I don't know what it looks like, but this was like round, solid. It looked like almost like it was dunked into. Yeah, Henk, maybe you should say something.
Hey, Henk, you got a comment?
Yeah, I mean, it was, we've got an early flowering granny here, which flowers the same time as Anna, approximately. It comes very early, but it's granny. And it's usually without that cultivar. It wasn't in CA, it was in RA. So can't be the concentrations of gas. It's not a CA, it was just normal RA fruit. It seems that they are very cold sensitive. And I've seen in several places it looks like a cold burn, like Elke described. It's directional and it's damaging on the epidermis and not in the skin at all, and it goes completely brown. It looks like typical hot water scald, but now a cold scald.
Hank, were the fruit dry going in?
Yes, yeah, completely dry. Yeah.
Humidity, high humidity or low humidity?
Just a normal RA store, nothing. I think the only difference is the fruit gets packed because on early grannies there's normally a market to be in the market quickly. So the fruit comes in, it gets packed, and then it goes into forced cooling, and our forced cooling it's time based, so everything has to be rushed. I can only think it's somewhere there.
I will caution you, and then there's the data on this. When you cool fruit rapidly, you end up with a situation where the fruit suddenly become colder than the air around it. So you've got, it becomes a dew point surface. And unbeknownst to the operator, there's film of water condensing on that super cool fruit, because it may be that it's going out into an atmosphere in the packing house where the air is warm, holding more moisture. That moisture will condense on the fruit of the skin because the skin has been cooled below the dew point. And it's a temporary phenomenon, but it does happen even in storerooms during the heating and cooling of the room. And there's evidence that there's moisture condensing on the surface, and once, even though it's not visible and dripping, it's there, and that becomes a solution in which you could maybe have some damage occurring, rusting or burning, as you call it. So watch for the humidity of the air, and make sure it's not carrying a lot of moisture. I'm referring to what I call dew point of the air.
Yeah, it's I think most of our cold stores run below 0. So your absolute moisture content of the cold store is very low. The humidity is normally, below 0, it's normally 100%, but your absolute moisture content is so low, so we don't get condensation. The normal procedure is because we have things governing it. We call them inspectors, and the fruit has to be a certain temperature before loading out. So I mean, that is the normal procedure on early market fruit, because this is typical early market fruit, is you cool them down. Excuse me. Once they're on temperature, they are staged for the next container. So they go in through the airlock into the container and then out. And the container runs at 0 approximately, -half. So and I've not seen that damage in. Only see it in early fruit, never in fruit that comes later. It's always the first ones. The first week of golden, again, we've got an early golden, which is panorama golden. I see it in that, and I see it in the early granny, and after that it disappears.
Hank, maybe just a comment is if you look at those very old kid and waste things papers. The respiration is still quite actively falling in the first couple of days, well, actually a couple of weeks after harvest. So as between yourself and Dr. Prang's comments, those fruit are also the ones that will be producing the most CO2. So perhaps that condensation, because we all know after packing, pallets don't, or boxes don't immediately return to the cold store. So there is some condensation on the fruit. So if that is stuck directly into forced air tunnels to get them out to market, I think that's where the main risk of what Dr. Prang is saying in terms of CO2 buildup, given that those fruit will still have a very high respiration rate compared to something that stood for 2 weeks.
I don't have a picture, unfortunately, quickly with me, but it looks like typical. If you look through the airstream, it looks like typical airstream damage, cold airstream damage on a when there's a big temperature difference between the fruit and the airstream, you get that physical burning. That's the only way it looked for me. Or either that, or it looked like soft scald, but it turns brown. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture with me. Soft scald sometimes turns more blackish.
Okay, Elke, you want to comment?
I just wanted to know, just as a matter of interest, like in RA, we always say RA can't have CO2 damage, but some of the values I've seen in RA stores where they measure them is extremely high. So I was just wondering whether anyone, maybe they're not brave enough to say, but is this a common thing, or was I just lucky to find a few like that?
I'm nodding, Elka. It's amazing where we call it air storage, but let's say if they're filling a store and they partially fill it, they perhaps have the air curtains and even the door shut. The next day they come back and there's an amazing amount of CO2 that's come out of high respiring fruit over the course of a few hours or overnight. There are cases where, let's say, propane-powered forklifts have died going in because into what they call was the RA store, but the fruit had pulled down the oxygen so much that the propane forklifts couldn't operate well. Yes.
Wow.
So yes, the answer is they're coming in highly respiring, and may be perceived as RA, but that's why I always say, and I've mentioned, get your temperature and CO2 and oxygen monitors going so you can do some forensic work later on. And again, even by knowing the temperature, you can see if there was an inadvertent dew point phenomenon because outside air came in onto that RA fruit. When it was moved between rooms, you open it up or whatever, then the forensic work can begin afterwards to see what might have caused it. And one other thing I want to say to Hank, it's been my observation that these fruit that are early picked are very highly green without very little accessory pigment. You know, they're very green with no reds and yellow and those other accessory pigments that help mitigate the radical oxygen molecules generated in the course of photosynthesis. Those skins are very sensitive to damage. So quite often you'll see the sun side of the fruit, which is greener, having more damage than the shade side. And the only difference is the shade side has less chlorophyll, and that also is another source of, which I call it the radical oxygen phenomenon that ends up with various skin disorders. So that's just the nature of the highly chlorophyll, highly active nature of the fruit, high respiring, you're dealing with a very sensitive situation.
Good. Thanks, Bob. Are there any other questions, comments? It doesn't look like it. So to the presenters, thank you very much.
Richard, can
Yeah.
I maybe have
Yeah,
a
certainly, Rob. Fire away.
last question for Dr. Prang? I've seen core flush development for DCA stored golden delicious. Now, my understanding with core flush is that is later CO2 exposure. And the thing is, some operators are in the habit, specifically for golden delicious, to raise the CO2 later in storage. But obviously, then you um, have a higher risk of core flush development. Do you think it wise to elevate CO2 under DCA's low oxygen conditions for something like Goldens that would be a practice in normal CA?
Well, I'm trying to understand the context of what you described.
So in your one slide, you noted that for Golden Delicious, some recommendations allow you to increase CO2 later in storage. Now, would you still advise that under the oxygen levels utilized in DCA, given that you could perhaps risk core flush development?
I would start by saying I'd be open to letting it go up. But when you say core flush, I also say to myself, that is usually also provoked by cold temperature, too cold a temperature. And so I would be looking at, with your golden delicious scenario, what temperature was this happening at? And is it necessary to keep it that cold? That is, you can mitigate or reduce the risks by increasing your store temperature. Okay, so keep that tool in mind, that you could increase the temperature. The other thing, and I alluded to it, and certainly with Golden Delicious, it's true. You should be considering taking a look at the weight loss on the fruit. In my book, I advocate for 2 and 2, that is 2% loss in the first 2 months, and after that, slow it down to 0 loss, because it reduces the risk of things like core flush and other disorders. So I would ask that you take a look at, considering an increase in temperature. If you're seeing this problem, consider taking a look at weight loss. And why am I mentioning it with regard to Golden Delicious? It's all to the good, because Golden Delicious is prone to bruising, and the cure for that is a bit of weight loss before you handle them. Also, they're less likely to bruise at a warmer temperature. If you've handled very cold Golden Delicious, they will bruise, especially if they haven't lost any moisture. Okay, so again, it's a few factors that might help reduce that core flush.
Yes, I think the main, I almost want to call it skittishness, is we are so used to storing Golden Delicious at a set point of minus 0.5. I mean, I've personally haven't really heard of people storing at warmer temperatures, especially for long-term storage. Now, perhaps for your for some background knowledge, Golden Delicious is still the largest cultivar in the South African makeup. So there's a very strong push to store for 9 months to really get those later, better paying slots.
Yes. And it's doable. But with regard to temperature, and I've said this several times, I don't know why the South African industry is so fixated on such a cold temperature for Golden Delicious. Again, that's their decision, and you have to respect it. There must be reasons, but I would wonder why you might save some money in refrigeration costs as well if you allow that temperature to go up a bit in your Golden Delicious stores.
Henk, maybe you can comment on the temperature uses.
It's yeah, and there was a lot of research done in the 70s, 80s on, I think it was done by Harvey Eckstein and who came before him, Jewish guy,
Ginsberg.
Ginsberg. Yeah, and yeah, so that's so I think at least what if I remember correctly, it's more than 20, 30 years research. That's why we ended up on -half. Was to reduce, because we do it because our setup, the setup of the fruit is slightly different from the European fruit. I mean, we see if we grow European varieties, we can normally go colder than what they do. And the reason for going cold is on golden specific, the market requires a green, the market where we sell is in Africa, where the cold chain ends as soon as it arrives. And they require a fruit to be green for at least a week at their room temperature, which is 30 plus. So if a vessel arrives, a vessel has got several different containers from several different suppliers on. They go for the green ones first, and then as the day goes on, the yellow ones sell later in the day, which is at lower prices. So for us, everything is color. Everything it has to maintain its color into the market, and it's not a golden as you would know it. There is no reference to a gold in this fruit. It's a completely green fruit. It's actually a greener. It's not a golden anymore, because the market is a tough outside market, and they require the fruit to be able to withstand at least a week at their temperatures in the sun, which is 30 plus, could be 40 plus.
Yes, there are several. I'm thinking of Australia has the same philosophy. Sometimes there's a market for the green colored Golden Delicious, and also in France. In both cases, and this is unique to Golden Delicious. Please don't, and I mentioned this earlier, it doesn't carry for all varieties, but Golden Delicious tends to stay greener if you give it a shot of high CO2 at the beginning of storage. Keep in mind, I caution on this because, as I've shown you, don't get your oxygen CO2 ratio out of whack if you do that. But that's something that those two industries in France and Australia have found. Now that, again, is before DCA and MCP showed up in the industry. With DCA and MCP, you can achieve the green, I think, with a DCA by using DCA. And if you wish to use the MCP, you can even do that at the end of the DCA storage on your Goldens. They're green. Before you run them onto the market, consider putting on the MCP then if you feel that they're going to turn yellow in the marketplace.
And it just, I mean, from that research, I think it was in the 70s, 74, if I remember correctly. We use the tolerance of Goldens of CO2. So we pack them all in airtight bags of a considerable thickness, 65 micron. We close them, and I've measured CO2 in that bags to be 14%. If they leave them out in the field as they do, and the Golden survives like no other apple, and it stays green. Eventually, the CO2 becomes toxic because it dissolves in the moisture, and then you get skin damage. But you retain your color a long time by suffocating the fruit with very high CO2 concentration. So we use that specifically in that market, the tolerance of Goldens to CO2 so that's why we are where we are. We close them off, we send them away, they keep them at room temperature, the CO2 goes up, the color stays green, and they sell them. That's how it works, yeah.
But Hank, and you've given a good example. If you just seal them up in the poly bag, the respiration will push the CO2 up, and you're generating them. I hear you say 13-14% CO2. The rest is going to be oxygen. So that's a total of 21. The other part is 7. So that's still within the ratio that I said, up to 2% CO2 to oxygen. So 14 divided by 7 oxygen, you have no problems. You shouldn't have any problems, and you're keeping the fruit green. So again, because you've got the higher oxygen, that CO2 can be there and achieve your green retention, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, I know it's something that is used commercially. That's the reason why it works. But unfortunately, it gives a taint. You can smell. It smells funny if you open the bag. You can smell that there's something wrong, but it disappears the way that they sell it, and then that's why we sell Goldens in a lots in Africa, and other people don't, because we use that. We use the high tolerance, high CO2 tolerant. The 1-MCP does not hold a green color back as well as CO2. It bleaches over time. I mean, we've seen that quite often we store Goldens a lot of the time, 12 months, and then at the latter part of the storage period, you lose green color. So 1-MCP has a very small, much smaller effect on the retaining of green color than retaining firmness. It loses the chlorophyll, so you end up with a white Golden, which they don't want.
It's almost a bleached green. It's not the same green.
The same with grannies. If you store granny too long, it loses its color, and it turns, like a dirty green color, which is a white green color, not really green and not really white. It's something in between.
And I asked Bram, when we hear what Henk is saying, Bram, do you think with your point that that low oxygen, as long as possible at the low oxygen, gives you a better green retention on the shelf afterwards, a better quality of green, or did you notice that?
So it does depend whether you assess by means of color chart or colorimeter. My personal opinion, there is a difference, a statistical difference. My question becomes whether one can physically see 1.5 degrees of U. Probably not. But generally speaking, the 3 DCA treatments, the appearance was quite similar. The problem with the XLO with ethylene scrubbing treatment is the oxygen was simply so high that the scald was unacceptable. So the question regarding what the effect of CO2 would be is a different one under those low oxygen conditions. But generally, very nice, still very green fruit. But one needs to also appreciate that there was an average difference between the seasons, starch breakdown of almost 10%. So the season in which the fruit were less mature also had much greener color.
Richard, you may recall we had that nice pear conference down in Argentina, and during that trip, I recall seeing some Pacums that Gabriela Calvo had stored and showed us. And that's not Granny Smith, I know, but it was quite impressive how the green stayed on the Pacums, and then the MCP treated didn't show the same green retention as the DCA. That was with Pacums in Argentina. So again, Hank, you know, you have to go with what you know works to get that colored, so the color of green that the market will pay you for. But you know, I think you've got several options to maybe think about. But I didn't get an answer to why you can't put the temperature up if you're worried about, say, core flush. Is there what has anyone tried in South Africa storing at warmer temperatures for grannies and other things to save money on refrigeration?
Maybe it's Jaco speaking. Yes, Robert, we certainly have tried it with 1-MCP. We've tried higher temperatures, and I fully agree with Henk and his summary of our situation. We sell Goldens in the market that want unnaturally green Goldens compared to the rest of the world. And we've certainly seen, if you go up half a degree or a degree on long-term golden storage, that we lose color, we lose the chlorophyll. So that is why we can't really go up.
I know, I understand.
Maybe just a comment on Bram. We've also seen that core flush, but only it was very specific on almost pre-optimum fruit, stored with 1-MCP and cooled down very fast. I've only seen it in cases where that combination was in kind of pre-optimum, very fast cooling with 1-MCP. And I think if you just cool it down a little bit slower, or even delay your 1-MCP treatment a little bit, I think, in my opinion, you will negate that risk of the core flush.
Yeah. So Jaco, just for full disclosure, it was a very rapidly filled room, was pre-optimum, and it was stored for 9.5 months.
Okay,
1-MCP, DCA, all of that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that Kobus van der Merwe did a lot of work on temperature and grannies specifically, and actually the scald was a little bit better with higher, because we know it is a chilling actually causes it. But he can store long because of greasiness and yellowing, so that was the issue, and that's why we store grannies so low, definitely.
Good. Any more?
I wanted to find out from Robert, what does he think the future is for CA? Where are we going? What is new, except for maybe the carbon dioxide ratio? That seems to be the new thing. Other than that, are there any new developments? It feels like we kind of on the RQ we've gotten a little bit not stuck, but it works. So, or the DCACF. But where do you see the future of or new advances in controlled atmosphere?
Oh, new advances. Oh my. I think that it's learning how, this is not a great answer. I think we have migrated through different philosophies over the last few decades, Elka. You may remember when we were all trying to get rapid CA. Then there was, ethylene scrubbing, and then went into ULO, or sorry, not ULO, but and I tried it, and some of your colleagues in the 1990s, the rapid temporary auctions at the beginning, and then we got into the MCP anti-ethylene, and then DCA. It's the winners will be using this kind of discussion we're having right now is important to understand the context that every variety that's coming on the market comes with its own quirks. And my comment would be, I'm frustrated with the amount of new varieties, mainly apples and even pears, that are being promoted as something new. And the industry has to pick the winners and losers. And it's terrible. You come out with, there's constant pressure to take the latest new variety, and that'll be the next big thing. And quite often these are pushed at the growers with very little post-harvest information. That's my concern, Elka, that I can't get much clear information on a lot of these new varieties. And it's a best guess. And quite often you can lose a lot of the value in storage. The promise was there, but you can't store them and realize the profit in the marketplace because no one told you how to store them properly. And there's too much proprietary club variety stuff being flogged. Maybe I'm going on a rant, but it's frustrating. And all I can tell people is take a look at the parents of those varieties and figure out that the variety is somewhere between the requirements of parent A and the requirements of parent B, and start from there. That's all I can say. I see this as a tsunami of new varieties, and too much being pushed with not enough information to make some money on it.
Any comments on that?
I couldn't agree more.
The other question, Dr. Prange, is whether some of these cultivars, I know some of the older heritage cultivars simply don't lend themselves to CA storage. And now you have these, for instance, now I'm playing around with some red flesh apples. And the comments from the European side is it's wonderful for the first 6 months, and thereafter they can't store it anymore. Which obviously for us as a Southern Hemisphere grower is great because, well, we want to export it, and if you can't store it, well, then it's fine, we'll supply. But maybe perhaps not only a lack of information on storability, but perhaps even in the breeding program, a lack of focus on storability.
Yes, and I'll extend my comments a bit more. And I think, and I'm struggling to, I can't figure out how to get the answer to my question. I think the breeders have thrown a lot of stuff in the marketplace that are debilitated in their normal ethylene-based ripening. A lot of these new varieties that are staying firmer, selected by the breeding programs, are really not like the old varieties that produced a lot of ethylene and ripened and had a lot of flavor. These new varieties are essentially dead in terms of ethylene production. Are we walking into a situation where we have to actually waken up the fruit to get more flavor back in them, in these new varieties, before they're put on the marketplace? Or does the marketplace really care about taste? Sometimes I shake my head and think, you know, people love a tasteless Granny Smith when you can actually have a quite tasty Granny Smith. They don't care. It's hard, it's green, and that's all they care about. But I think the ethylene production is a mystery to me, and how to document. I hear people anecdotally saying, oh, that's a low ethylene variety. I say, well, prove it to me. Maybe we have to take Brahms' philosophy. It's a cumulative ethylene production as opposed to a spot measurement, almost like the cumulative oxygen. These new varieties, are they naturally low in ethylene and you document that by saying, okay, here's the production from pre-harvest, picked green through climacteric to stored fruit of that variety, and that they're just naturally weak ethylene producers. I'm wondering what's going on there in these new varieties.
Yes, and
Okay, thanks.
some need ethylene. That was also quite a shock. Somebody presented something on new varieties, and some of them actually need ethylene to kind of store properly.
We support that, Elka. This is an anecdotal from a colleague out at our Summerlin Research Center. She stored some fruit at room temperature, and they never ripened, but she put them in the cold, and guess what? You know, apples and pears do need a bit of cold to stimulate ripening, and they started to ripen up. Now, again, that's another wild card in ethylene metabolism. And that's why, you know, we say scald versus scald is chilling induced. Well, when you chill the fruit, the ethylene production comes up, you get more scald. We know that because when we put MCP and block it, we don't get the scald. So there's some interesting metabolism there.
Perhaps a comment on does the market even care about taste? My personal experience regarding gala, we have a little saying, hoe rooier hoe mooier, the redder the prettier. And some of these newer selections, they have wonderful red color, but the aroma profile, the taste just isn't there. And then when you go to an orchard, you sneak off to the old Tenroy Gala cross pollinators and go and get yourself a apple during harvest season. Just the aroma profile is amazing compared to these extremely red, highly marketable galas.
Yes, that John Feldman and his colleagues years ago showed that the red strains of Red Delicious, the redder the strain, the lower, the weaker the flavor profile. But I want to come back on that comment. And you guys are quite advanced in this because you've done a lot of great work. Are we able to say that, you know, if you give Granny Smith, for instance, a DCA treatment, one of the DCA technologies that I've found, and other people in industry say, you enhance the flavor of that fruit immensely. It is very noticeably better. But is it worth even talking about it if the marketplace doesn't care?
I think the marketplace just cares about, is it green and is it firm, and is it available throughout the year? But I mean, literature-wise, obviously, the fluorescence spike being correlated with some ethanol production, and ethanols being one of the building blocks of esters. Yes, certainly there's a aroma component that is positive. But I think we'll fool ourselves if we say we'll get a premium based on the aroma profile.
Unfortunately, I think that's the marketplace telling us we have to respect what the marketplace wants, and we can't fight that too much. So I think back to the general question is always know what the market wants and try to customize your storage and variety selection and release to market according to what the market is asking for. I mean, we know, for instance, if you look at the champagne wine industry, champagne is custom made for every different market in the world. It's not just one version of champagne. Same goes for what we're talking about with apples and pears, I think. Have to have enough market intelligence to know how to manage the variety selection, the strain, and that's another thing I want to go on. There's a lot of different strains, and I think you've even fallen into that with the South African industry, strains of Gala and Delicious, etc. How much of that is really marketing and how much is it really different? I've come into some proof that some of the strains actually are different and have to be stored differently. It's not just cosmetic color. There is some actually real differences in the storage requirements. Again, that's where the researchers have to sift out the wheat from the chaff and decide whether a certain strain is actually going to need a certain different storage condition. Like I think Hank was saying earlier, there's an early strain of your granny that he knows has to be handled differently in storage. I think that's where, you know, you can make or break the profit for what you decide to grow. Getting to know more about the strain requirements and knowing whether there's real differences or not in your major money-making varieties.
I think the short answer will be the major money-making varieties are club varieties that don't have different strains yet. The strains are predominantly on your older open varieties.
Let's hope it stays that way, Brom. The requirements don't change too much once you get information on that club variety. It's pretty immutable and doesn't change too much once you've figured it out.